Call the next speaker, Baroness Fox of Buckley.
My Lords, when considering these amendments, at first I thought about tackling the perpetrators guilty of persistent stalking and constant and continued terrorising or harassment of the victim, and the kind of stories that we've just heard from the noble lady Baroness Newlove and the testimony of Cheryl. That is what came to mind. Anyone who's known friends or family on the receiving end of, or indeed experienced themselves, that kind of treatment of being constantly living under the awful reality of fear and looking over one's shoulder, and sometimes then facing police indifference or negligence. That, it seems to me, is the kind of thing that springs to mind when I looked at these amendments at first. And yet, I have some real qualms and queries about these amendments, and feel that however emotive this topic is, we need to pause and be cool, and at the very least I think there's need for far more precision in terms of what or who we are talking about. Who exactly does this allow the law to target? What constitutes a serial offender? What constitutes a serious enough offence to trigger this perpetrator or these kind of perpetrator interventions? And is there any time limits at all in the surveillance or sharing of information or labelling of someone as a perpetrator? I worry that we potentially can bring our own prejudices and subjective views and assume that we all agree on who or what we are talking about. The noble Lord Hunt of King's Heath stated as fact that past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour. I dispute that. It flies in the face of agency, the possibility of reform, and it is not necessarily the way we should develop law. We should certainly suggest that it's not always true. And in all instances, when we say that past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour, and we've heard that terrible story of Colin, whose past behaviour then escalated and went on. But this bill in particular broadly spells out abuse to include a huge range of different types of behaviour. Do we always think that that will escalate and end up as murder? We are told that if somebody moves and starts a new relationship or moves away, that they must report to the police, but that assumes that they will always be an abuser. And we assume that the police should have the right under Clare's law to warn partners. But I again want to know, does that mean that we consider abuse as a permanent feature in somebody's personality? I do worry about a national system of surveillance that follows around somebody dubbed a perpetrator, that involves all state agencies. I amount that this actually amounts to state stalking of those labelled abusers. I worry when perpetrators are accused in this bill of hiding in plain sight, as though they are permanently committing offences, when maybe they are living in plain sight as citizens who have done the time for their crime, but that actually they are living in plain sight a life of not offending. Why do we always see them as the perpetrators? Of course, the most extreme examples have been given here today, and some of those terrorising examples of the most violent abusers mentioned leading to preventable murder are what concerns me and many of us here. And yet this very legislation has broadened out the meaning of what abuse means to an ever-expanding number of behaviours, as though all of them are escalating behaviours, and I worry about losing a sense of perspective or justice. I worry that we end up focusing on offenders, not offences, and as legislators, that is nerve-wracking. I do not think that if somebody has been abusive, that they should forever be tarred as abusive, or we see it as predetermined that they will carry on. I think we go very close, if we don't be careful here, of seeing certain people as malevolent, dangerous, evil. Are we saying that those who have ever committed any of the multitude of abuses named in this law are a peculiar breed of criminal who inevitably, no matter what, will strike again, even though, as I say, and they will carry on posing an ongoing threat? It is reminiscent, far too reminiscent, of outdated views about criminal types. And that view of people has a long, unsavoury history. Baroness Burton earlier asked us to spot the signs, but I am worried about us wandering around spotting signs in people. In an earlier part of this committee, we were told that after football matches and drinking, that this might lead to domestic abuse. And the spotting the signs version of legislative change strikes me as being too arbitrary and rather dangerous. And I have to say, whenever we discuss domestic abuse, there is a lurking class prejudice that I often detect. But I think that the most important thing is there's a danger of lumping together a variety of individuals and behaviours. Just one other point as an aside. My Lords, and many of my Lords have mentioned that we've all received a huge amount of information before these particular amendments were discussed. And that is true. And then in this debate so far, those briefings have been used as evidence. I'd like to just make a caveated note about what constitutes evidence. When people stand up here and say the evidence shows, this is not quite the same as the evidence of the efficacy or safety of, for example, a vaccine against coronavirus. The evidence that we are sent as legislators is often commissioned by and presented by lobbying organisations. Their briefing documents, much repeated in this House, might be repeated as facts or truth, but they're not actually always objective or, in fact, factual. And at the very least, we should recognise that they can be contentious. So I would ask for some caution that whilst we want to deal with the most extreme examples, in the course even of this discussion, facts and evidence has been thrown in that's been more ideological than helpful.